Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're looking at the politics of climate change. How is the world addressing this unique policy challenge? Is the system working? And if not, what could be done to improve it? Hello, my name is Jennifer Hudson, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. There is common agreement that climate change poses the greatest policy challenge of our age. The cost of getting it wrong could be immense, but the barriers to getting it right are dauntingly high. Action is needed on a global scale, but global politics is deeply fractured, and individual countries may be tempted to free ride on the actions of others. So what are the global governance structures through which the world is attempting to address this challenge? Are they delivering, or do they need reform? Well, three of the leading experts on these questions, David Coen, Julia Kreienkamp, Tom Pegram, are based at the UCL Department of Political Science and have just written a book on the subject. It's called Global Climate Governance, and it's published now by Cambridge University Press. And two of those authors join me now to discuss its findings. Julia Kreienkamp is a research assistant at the UCL Global Governance Institute, working on the project Global Governance and the European Union, Future Trends and Scenarios. And Tom Pegram is Associate Professor in Global Governance and the Deputy Director of the UCL Global Governance Institute. Julia and Tom, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, good to be here.
Thanks, Jennifer. Great to be here.
Could we start by defining what it is that we're actually talking about? What do we mean when we refer to policies to address climate change? Julia, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, sure. I think it's quite useful to have this initial framing because climate change policies really come in many different forms. But broadly speaking, all of these policies will aim at helping societies mitigate or adapt to the risks posed by global warming, and possibly also addressing some of the distributional or justice-related issues involved. So historically, the focus of the global climate change regime has been very much on mitigation. So that means reducing or offsetting emissions, with the ultimate goal here to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So mitigation really is about everything from transforming our energy and transport systems to preserving and restoring forests and other natural carbon sinks. So as I said, mitigation has been very much at the heart of the global climate change regime from the start, but it became soon clear that mitigation alone would not be enough and that it had to be supplemented by adaptation. Basically, adaptation is about building resilience and learning how to live on a warmer planet. So this could involve building flood defenses, for example, but also things like making crops more heat resistant. And although adaptation has climbed up the global agenda in recent years, it still receives comparatively little attention and definitely less money than mitigation. So this is partly because the immediate benefits of adaptation are more local, and also because the immediate need for adaptation is mainly in developing countries. But I think it's really important to stress that mitigation and adaptation are complementary strategies, and they're often mutually reinforcing. And it is also important to emphasize that effective mitigation, adaptation, governance will depend on the delivery of finance and support for developing countries. And then finally, more recently, another concern next to mitigation and adaptation has received attention on the global level, and that is loss and damage. So essentially, loss and damage refers to climate change impacts that we cannot mitigate or adapt to. So, for example, this is a major concern for small island states, which are likely to lose substantial territory due to rising sea levels. That's obviously not something you can adapt to. However, on the global level, when it comes to loss and damage, institutional frameworks are very weak, and the issue remains very contentious because obviously it opens up a lot of really thorny questions around responsibility, justice, and compensation.
Thank you for setting that stage for us, Julia. Tom, I want to come to you for this question next around action on a global scale. I started this section saying, action on these matters is required at a global scale. And that probably seems obvious to people given the nature of the discourse around climate change in democracies and across the world. But could you spell out for us why global action is needed, and why do we need global governance in particular?
Yeah, it's almost a cliche, this idea that global problems require global solutions. But I think it's actually very helpful to interrogate that assumption and to ask, well, do they? I think that was a very prominent mantra in the 1990s. Today, I think it is more challenged. Indeed, there are people out there who would actually contest that idea. And certainly, if we think about it, there are certain activities which clearly are best addressed at a more local level. If we look at COVID-19, we can see the extraordinary mobilization of local resources by state structures, indeed the important role of, say, local public health authorities. But there clearly are other issues that are best addressed at a global level. And to put it very, I guess, starkly, essentially, these issues are those that secure our collective future. So historically, we might have thought about nuclear weapons and the non-proliferation treaty regime. And today, obviously, global governance applied to climate change. Climate change is the quintessential global problem. Principally because the location of emissions is completely irrelevant to the outcome, which is, of course, global heating. So perhaps the question is best phrased as, well, what kinds of governance should happen at what layers or levels, and what is the relationship between those levels of governance? And if we think about climate change, there is a sort of an emergent scholarship now looking at climate change as not just a wicked problem, but a super wicked problem. And environment is already really challenging states and governments like never before. And in a weird way, states just seem to be too big and too small to deal with this kind of problem. They're too big in the sense that they struggle to really control the very local, decentralized, say, activity leading to ecological destruction, as famously argued by Elinor Ostrom and all of her work on ecosystem management. But they're also too small in the sense that they can't really deal with the huge transboundary global problems, such as carbon emissions, but also, of course, ocean acidification. And there's a whole array of different issues all sort of within the basket of what is a hugely complex planetary biosphere. And so from a governance perspective, I would say the challenge of climate change sort of raises a bit of a paradox for us in the sense that we need the rapidity of sort of top-down command and control, but we also need the effectiveness of the kind of bottom-up entrepreneurialism. So for political scholars, the key point perhaps is that we have lots of things today, and not just climate change. We might also talk about, say, nanotech, biotech, or we might talk about artificial intelligence, all sorts of things that we should be coordinating to solve at a global level, but we're not. So what is the collective action problem underlying that inaction? And that's, I guess, the great task that's before us.
You mentioned the collective action problem, and that's obviously going to be, conditioned and influenced by state interests and within states, kind of the more local level interests. And so, we're starting to talk now here about the kind of need to act at a global scale, whilst looking at state level actors and what they bring to the table and how they're willing to coordinate. Can you tell us about what the global governance community is doing at the moment? Are we on target to keep the global warming limits that we think the world can live with?
Yeah, these are really difficult questions. Obviously, historically, we're asking a lot of the global governance community. Really, the post-Second World War settlement is now, for many scholars, seen as not fit for purpose. But I think we want to be a little bit careful here around the language we're using as well. So what is this global governance community? Who is the we? Clearly, there is no global democratic authority. What we have are lots of factions, and we might think of those in terms of nation states, but we might also want to bring into consideration private authority as well. And across all of these different actors, there's a lot of jostling, a lot of different motivations, a lot of different preferences as to, when the rubber hits the road, people can agree that climate change is something we need to act on, but how we act or how we respond is very contested. So depending on who we ask within this community, you're going to get a different response to the question. So if we were to ask, say, low island nations and perhaps most of Africa, especially those countries in the Sahel region, their response would be that we're not doing very well. I mean, the early onset impacts of climate change are apparent now in the form of drought, food security questions. But also, of course, we saw the fires in Australia in the west of the US last year. Forest fires are now spreading. We also have depletion in water aquifers. There are serious early onset impacts already occurring around the globe. And I guess that brings me to the second question on the limits, and are we on track to keep them within safe limits? And it's a very difficult question to answer. Obviously, I'm not a climate scientist, and I think we all need to proceed with a lot of caution. I would say doing this project has been a real crash course in climate science for me. And I thought I was quite well informed before, but actually I was kind of, there was data which really made me sit up. And I would encourage everyone to investigate that data for themselves. The fact that we've actually emitted over half of all CO2 since 1990 was a shock to me. The rate of melting in the Arctic and the Antarctic is accelerating, and it is a huge amount of melt. And indeed, talking with Mark Maslin at UCL and other colleagues, the lag effect in CO2 heating, the fact that it takes 20 to 30 years for the full heating effect of CO2 to be realized is, again, something which is often missed, I think, in the public discourse. Australia, at its latitude, is already at 1.4 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures because it's slightly ahead of the global average. And there are questions about how much heating is already locked in. So I guess the key point is that all we can really know with any certainty is that the CO2 levels in pre-industrial times were pretty stable, and we should really be trying to get back to those. 2 degrees is kind of terra incognita, and a lot of the modeling is experimental. The tiniest change in exponentials can throw those models off. So we need to proceed with a lot of caution. But obviously, the key point is that we need to get moving. And on the political front, and I'm sure we're going to get more into this, things are moving. I mean, public opinion is really shifting. It's a surprise, perhaps, to just remember that Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg, they only really began to mobilize in 2018. We now have the Paris Agreement, of course. Its mechanisms are really crucial to galvanizing action, but we really do need to get ahead of the scientific evidence.
Tom, before we go to Julie, I think to pick up on the Paris Agreement, I want to pick up on something that you said about this change in public opinion. We've seen in some other data that public are much more in recognition and cognizant of the problem of climate change. How do you see, I think, this kind of swell of recognition and awareness from the public as a motivator to find the political will, or as an enabler to generate the political will to take action?
Yeah, I mean, I think the emergence of sort of protest action, so say the Sunset Movement in the US, which is a lot of young people mobilizing, obviously the school strikes, have been hugely inspiring, and they've clearly made real inroads in terms of shifting public opinion. And I think that's where we need to support that sort of activity. And clearly, I think governments are waking up to the fact that they need to respond to that constituency seriously. And maybe there has been a little bit too much emphasis on climate science. Perhaps to really galvanize change, we need to also be looking much more at the work of, say, political activists, the insights of social anthropologists, even psychologists. The key challenge, perhaps, is how to build social capital and political trust to bring people together in a time of real political polarization. And it seems like governments and the state are really struggling to play that role at the moment. So how do we overcome that politicization? And the other key issue, I think, is when you dig into the opinion data, yes, the shift is impressive in terms of people waking up to the risk posed by climate change to their lives. But when it comes to actual policies, for example, carbon tax on, say, car emissions, opinions are much more divided as to what people are willing to accept. And I think that, again, that's part of this political negotiation that needs to be engaged very seriously by our political representatives.
Tom mentioned the Paris Agreement, and Julia, if I could come to you, the adoption of the agreement received a lot of attention. We are celebrating the kind of US's return to Paris in recent days, and it's raised hope for more effective global governance responses. Could you explain briefly to our audience what the Paris Agreement is?
Yeah, sure. So the Paris Agreement really is the second global climate agreement that has been negotiated under the UNFCCC, that is the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, which is kind of the most important framework we have in global governance for climate change. And the first treaty we had was the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. And what Kyoto did, it introduced legally binding emission reductions for and only for industrialized countries, who at the time were the biggest emitters and who also, of course, have the greatest historical responsibility for climate change. Now, there are different opinions on how successful or unsuccessful the agreement was, but as Tom has kind of outlined already, these efforts have failed to deliver on what ultimately matters, and that is preventing dangerous levels of climate change. So part of the problem with Kyoto was political. The US famously didn't ratify it because they didn't support binding emissions reductions, especially since emerging economies such as China would not be subject to the same rules. But I think in addition, and on a broader level, Kyoto embodied quite a narrow problem definition, where climate change was about really short-term emission cuts and not so much about long-term systemic change, which is really what we need. So this is where the Paris Agreement comes in, and I think it does represent quite a decisive shift away from the Kyoto framework. So first of all, what the Paris Agreement does is it enshrines long-term collective goals, including the commitment to keep temperature rises to well below 2 degrees and ideally to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And that might sound like a small difference, but again, as Tom has kind of mentioned, there's actually a big difference between a 1.5 degree world and a 2 degree world. And it is significant that we now have the 1.5 in the treaty, even though it's an aspirational goal. So in a sense, all of this means that we have to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. And that is also in the treaty in kind of clunky terms. So the Paris Agreement acknowledges that to do that, all countries have to come on board, even though developed countries still have to lead this effort. And to ensure participation by virtually the whole world, there are no longer legally binding emission reduction targets on the global level. So instead, the Paris Agreement requires states to determine their own pledges, their own, it's called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. That's the technical term, but essentially these are voluntary pledges that states make. So the architects of the Paris Agreement realized that countries wouldn't, right away come up with super ambitious voluntary pledges. So, and in fact, the first round of NDCs, if you add them up, you still get temperature rises well below 3 degrees. So realizing that, the Paris Agreement requires that every 5 years, all state parties participate in something called the global stocktake. So that's basically a collective review of ambition. So everyone coming together, looking at how far have we come, how far do we still need to go. And following each of these stocktakes, parties are then required to submit updated pledges that are informed by this collective assessment. But beyond, some regulations around transparency, there are no global level mechanisms to enforce compliance with these pledges.
And how challenging from the perspective of kind of global governance experts is that going to be to realizing this? So there's a balance between bringing actors on board with non-binding outcomes and letting them locally define what's appropriate to reach the targets. But does that create an enforcement problem at the other side?
So I think there are many good reasons to be skeptical, of course, because ultimately what the Paris Agreement offers is promises, and many of these promises have been rather underwhelming so far. But it is the first time that we have a universal and dynamic and somewhat quite resilient global framework that has this long-term focus and not just on mitigation. And maybe most significantly is that it plays into kind of the need for multi-level, multi-actor governance that Tom has also talked about. So we've seen a lot of businesses, cities, sub-state and non-state actors that have tried to align their goals with the Paris Agreement. There are now structures on the global level to promote these activities. So we could say at the very least it has provided this kind of framework.
Tom, I want to come to you and think now beyond Paris. How does the wider system of global governance currently look like? And maybe you could give us an example. So if you're a novice and you're coming to UCL Uncovering Politics and you're listening to this podcast about climate governance, where do you look? How do you understand? Can you point to? Can you touch? Global governance or climate governance? So I think it's a really abstract problem for the average member of the public to engage with. So point us to what we can look and understand about this kind of wider system of global governance.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And obviously, this is something we have to engage in the seminars on the Masters in Global Governance. What is global governance? How do we know it when we see it? And when we think about systems, already that can be quite abstract, because ultimately, in a way, what we're talking about are systems within systems within systems. And the most important system, perhaps, is the planetary boundary system that Johan Rockström has made famous in his paper. And of course, our human-built governance systems operate within that very complex natural biosphere system. So when we try to get to grips with the governance system, I think normally we would point to the formal institutional structures, as Julia's framed, the Paris Agreement, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That is the domain where scholars have principally focused their attention. And there is a cottage industry of research on the global climate governance regime in that space. And some scholars rather cut-offly refer to it as a Cambrian explosion of state actors, market actors, NGOs. It is an incredibly diverse space. Also very interesting agencies. For example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, probably the most authoritative, certainly the most high-profile scientific authority in the world, issues annual reports on the state of the climate. And then we often talk about clusters of regimes or regime complexes to make things even more complex. So you have the climate change regime, but you have the biodiversity regime. And of course, all of these regimes will interface with the trade regime and the health regime and all sorts of other domains. So it can become quite challenging quite quickly to sort of make it tractable. So generally speaking, the point of departure would be the UNFCCC. And then what we often see are the debates focus on particular fault lines. So, for example, there's been a lot of debate on the pros and cons of fragmentation, or the entrepreneurialism, versus the potential drawbacks of fragmentation and the value of having some kind of more centralized, coordinated governance in place. The key drawback, of course, as Julia's mentioned, is the fact that emissions are still to peak. And that's also led scholars to go back to the drawing board somewhat and wonder whether some of their framing assumptions may have been incorrect, particularly this idea of the tragedy of the commons. When we think of the performance of the environment regime, the classic metaphor has been this tragedy of the commons, that we negotiate over the solutions, that we divide out the carbon cake, so everyone has so much carbon they can use. That's their carbon budget. We decide who's responsible for the emissions, who's going to pay, who's going to offset, and then we have some enforcement for possible defectors or cheaters. But this understanding of governance doesn't seem to have worked. The Kyoto Protocol, as Julie mentioned, was never fully operational. The Copenhagen COP in 2009 was an abject failure. And since then, we've really seen a new wave of very interesting scholarship trying to move away from a tragedy of the commons frame to thinking much more about power, thinking much more about political economy, thinking much more about value conflict, and particularly within local political systems. And this changing of frame is also, I think, reflected somewhat in the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is more decentralized, it's more delegated, it's more bottom-up, it's more multi-level governance. And that's probably what needs to happen, because on the one hand, this is incredibly challenging. It's very technical work to really tease out what the emissions or where the sources of emissions are in, say, the concrete industry. It takes real technical expertise. But clearly also the other issue is political blockage. And the risk is that the Paris Agreement, as currently understood at least, still allows countries to play quite fast and loose with their voluntary, nationally determined contributions. There has been a loss of the hard edge of accountability here. The Paris Agreement really has very few sticks or carrots to induce compliance. So what we might see over the coming years is a push back in the direction of legally binding obligations. And that's probably going to be driven by events. And many UN agencies are now predicting near-term non-linear change, which in layman's terms is really, we're talking about serious climate impacts, which we hope will be containable and that we will be able to amplify and convert into political action.
Julia, I want to come to you then. I mean, given Tom's commentary on the difficulties around Paris in terms of its enforceability, that might suggest that there's a need for more powerful global institutions to come in and kind of create this compliance disagreement among really powerful state actors. But then Tom's also portrayed this kind of tension between, having kind of a singular authority on this really flies in the face of state level actors where there can be lots of entrepreneurial leadership, where we might see innovation coming from. So where's the right balance? Do we need to delegate down to states? Is this where we're going to see leadership coming from? Or do we need a stronger, more powerful global institution to get us where we need to be?
I think in realistic terms, at least in the near term, until we get overtaken by events, as Tom has said, I don't think there will be appetite for a more powerful structure. I think the UNFCCC has kind of managed with the Paris Agreement to at least re-establish itself as a central node in this big regime complex. But of course, to do so, it couldn't have the same bindingness. So I think in the near term, really the accountability holders are domestic constituencies. And so global governance will be maybe thinking about how do you engage these constituencies, how and how do you engage these different actors. And then, of course, you also have frameworks for market-based mechanisms. And I think a lot has to happen in that space because, again, as Tom has said, it's actually quite complex to find out, who is emitting what, how do we measure that, where is the accountability and transparency in that sector. And I think that will be where frameworks on the global level, but also on the regional level, so for example, on the EU level, come in. And of course, the EU has kind of shown on a regional level that you can have more intrusive regulatory frameworks that in the climate space. But I don't think that anytime soon we will see that on the global level.
Julia, Tom mentioned the failure of COP Copenhagen. We were meant to have COP last year. That was postponed, obviously, because of the pandemic. And we now look forward to COP in Glasgow here in the UK in November. Can you give us a sense of what the expectation should be? What do we think is likely to be achieved?
Yes. So I think partly COP26 is important because the previous two climate summits have not been very inspiring. So the UN Secretary General has spoken of disappointment after the last summit in Madrid. So I think Glasgow can send an important signal that states are bringing new energy and momentum to the table. And of course, in this regard, it is very significant that the US is back in the game under President Biden. In terms of agenda for COP26, there's still some outstanding parts of the Paris rule book. So this is the rules for implementation that parties need to agree on. And in particular, language on global carbon markets. So the market mechanisms I've just mentioned, which have proven quite difficult. And I think finance will also be an important part of the conversation, because back in 2009 at the Copenhagen conference, rich countries have agreed to provide at least $100 billion per year in climate finance to the developing world from 2020. So I think developing countries will be keen to ensure that these promises are being kept, and also that more ambitious finance targets are being set. But maybe above all, COP26 has to be a kind of can-do conference, because right now we're at the stage of the process in the Paris Agreement where countries have to update their NDCs, their national pledges. So it's important that we see ambitious pledges coming in to build momentum for the conference. And in this regard, there are some promising developments. So US President Biden, for example, has pledged to achieve a net zero American economy by 2050. China, who is the largest global emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, has made new pledges last year aimed at achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. The EU, of course, has a 2050 net zero target. It has updated its 2030 target now, and so has the UK. And there are many other countries who have made some form of net zero commitment, and a growing number of them are enshrining these commitments into domestic law, which is also significant. But we are also seeing, I think, that countries find it much easier to make ambitious pledges and declarations for mid-century rather than ambitious targets for the next decade. So there's often a mismatch between this short-term and long-term planning. And there are also quite a few important countries that have submitted NDCs without raising ambition substantially, and a lot of countries who haven't submitted these pledges yet. And of course, what we really, really need in the end is for all these pledges not just to be raised, but actually implemented.
Great. Thanks, Julia. Tom, very briefly before we wrap up, in the run-up to COP, both you and Julia collaborated with colleagues from other universities on a policy brief that highlights the need for a just and socially inclusive transition to net zero carbon economy. I think we've collectively, globally, have realized the importance of inclusivity in response to COVID, the kind of current global challenge on our plates. Can you briefly explain what you mean by a just transition, and why is that so important?
Julia mentioned the issue of finance, and in many ways that goes to the heart of the question of, how we're going to undertake this transition. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has made it clear that the kind of decarbonisation required to meet a net zero target, it will be unprecedented. It's going to require the wholesale transformation of our societies, our transport systems, and everything else. And we also now see the World Economic Forum also really taking this agenda very seriously under sort of the rubric of the Great Reset. Now, the key concern here is, how do we actually proceed towards that transition? How do we ensure that transition is just in terms of socio-economic impacts, particularly on those groups who have already perhaps suffered greatly during the last decade or more of austerity. So there is a real concern around transitional justice, which is a frame which would be very familiar to human rights colleagues in other contexts. Well, that frame is now being applied to this issue of transition to a decarbonised economy. There are clearly very important social and economic implications that need to be taken into account here that go to questions of equity and inequality, and also, of course, ethnic inequality and other concerns that are long-standing in many societies. And so this is the great challenge is, we need to ensure that these policies are just, that they do fall on the broadest shoulders, if you will, but we also need to ensure that they are just, because otherwise they will not be sustainable. We need to build that political capital. We need to build that social trust in our communities to actually to make sure that these policies are received, are accepted, and can be sustained over the long haul. Because this isn't going to be a short-term project. This is the big one. And we're going to need everyone pulling together.
Thanks, Tom, very much. Thank you to Julia. This has really been a fascinating conversation, and the world has had a major global challenge in the form of COVID-19. And it will be interesting to see the lessons learned in terms of how we respond, both as nation states, as individuals, as a collective global set of actors, and what we can apply from the pandemic to climate. But it's a problem that's here, it's now, and it has huge implications, not just for our economies, our families, our livelihoods, but certainly for health. So it's really great to have you both here talking about this really important challenge and the research that you bring to it. If you want to hear more on these topics, the book that Julia, Tom, and David Coen have written is what we've been discussing. It's called Global Climate Governance, and it's published by Cambridge University Press. We also mentioned in the podcast the briefing paper, which is called Just Transition, Pathways to Socially Inclusive Decarbonization, and it's available on the website of the UCL Global Governance Institute. You'll find all the details on the webpage for this podcast's episode. Next week on UCL Uncovering Politics, we will be in fact hearing from Julia and Tom's co-author, David Coen. David's other book, Business Lobbying in the EU, is just out, and we'll be exploring with him in our episode next week the key findings from that research. Remember to make sure that you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe, and you can do that on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Jennifer Hudson. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics, and thank you very much for listening.